You are not a bad photographer, and you are not a bad editor. But if you feel like your editing is not where you want it to be, this video might help you. Welcome back, everybody. Today, we are going to be diving into exploring your style. Now, to do this, we're going to be going over 3 different looks. We will be going over the light and airy edit. We will be going over the dark and moody edit, and we will be going over a more balanced and neutral edit and comparing those 3, seeing how you feel. Now, to get into the mindset of these, of course, we have different considerations that we would have when you're going through these edits. Each of these images that we'll be editing, you will be able to walk through. I'm going to talk through my process and how I would go about editing these so that you can explore the versatility of your own style. So let's get into this. And first up, we're going to start with our light and airy edit. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, here we have our first image, and in this image we're going to be using Fuji 400H plus or muted. Now I'm looking at this image and it looks like it needs a little bit of work, just sort of to get my brain where it needs to start. And the first thing is I'm seeing some vignetting. So I'm going to use our lens correction tool. Normally I would use this after, but I really want this to have a balance as an exposure as possible all the way around. The next thing I will do is I'm going to work through our 3-step workflow, which is to apply a look, adjust exposure, and correct white balance. So first up, we'll go ahead and I'm just going to hover over Fuji 400H Plus. Now, both versions of Fuji 400H Plus are inspired by the actual film of Fuji 400H. The Plus refers to pushing that contrast a little further and smoothing out some of the transitions that you would find in the film so that they better work for digital. In the Plus version, like I said, you have something that's a little bit more contrasty, and muted is a softer look. Now, being that we are going for that light and airy look, I'm going to use the muted look, and there you go. So just real quick, here's our before and after, and that's without doing any of our other adjustments. So we've done our first step to apply the look. Next up, I will bring up my exposure just a little, and then I'm going to warm it up. Here we go. I think right about there feels good. So again, before and after, pretty simple. Now there is some other tools that we have. We can do all soft, which further mitigates some of that contrast. If you are facing a backlit or a harshly lit scene, the all soft tone profile will recover detail in both the highlights and the shadows. So here I'll go up to the preset slider and we'll bring this back all the way to 0. You can see where it started. And then when we applied it, it's back up here. Now, the nice thing about these is you can, decide what looks best for you. For me, I really think that here it looks good. The last tool, if we want, we have our light and airy assist. And what that does is it will take the background and the subject of the image, and it'll bring up the exposure and soften the contrast between the two. So here we'll go ahead and I'll use that preset slider. I'll bring it back to 0. And again, it's very subtle, but what it's doing is it's just creating an overall nice light and airy look. So there we go, before and after. One last thing to check the difference between the muted and the plus. Here you'll see muted and plus again. I'll hit plus to work through those same steps. If I wanted a little bit more of that contrast, I can still do my all soft, and it still retains a little more saturation like our plus looks have. And yeah, there you go. There is our before and after with a light and airy edit. Okay, so there you have it. Next up, we're going to get into our dark and moody edit. And this is, an image with a little more dramatic flair, whether that's boudoir, whether that's just a moody street photo. This is the time where you can sort of explore those darker tones. So let's go ahead and get ready for it. Maybe this is not quite dark and moody, but you get the idea. Okay, let's get started and we'll walk through this process next. Now, for the dark and moody edit, I'm going to be using one of the Portra 160 plus or muted looks. Again, plus is giving a little bit more contrast, and muted a softer tonal transitions between highlights and shadows. I really think that the Portra looks in general do a great job with those darker and moodier vibes. And Portra is just a beautiful film, and I think it has a lot of versatility that way. So our first thing here is I'm looking at this photo. I notice it's really bright. Of course, I know it's going to have to be brought down, but I'm going to lean into that contrast. So I'm going to be using the plus version of these 2 presets. Initially, I apply it. Honestly, this is a great image, and I really like how this looks out of the gates. but I am going to drop it down because I want to maximize for that dark and moody edit. So I'm going to grab my exposure and bring it down. And here I'm starting to see a lot of the detail come back in the skin. It's looking pretty nice. I could maybe try to cool it down a little bit, but actually with dark and moody, I tend to like a warmer vibe. I think that the warmth given really kind of, it comes into the shadows and it gives a lot more depth. Now, we can, again, just like we did in the other one, I could do all soft, but here I really only want to bring back the shadows. So I'm going to hit shadow soft and I'm going to bring up some of that shadow detail back. And what that's doing is it's maintaining the highlights, allowing me to further drop them down if I want and still have some of that detail in the shadow. But that's looking pretty good. As a quick look, here is our before and after. And like with light and airy, our dark and moody assist works in a similar way. Here with the dark and moody assist, it actually offers a little bit of a fade. Now, when you first click it, you might feel like it is a bit overpowered. Again, we can go to our slider. I can draw this back. And in fact, this tool is built to feel like if you were pulling film through a development process versus pushing it. Here, I just want a little bit of that fade and to bring down a little bit of that exposure. I think that feels nice. And the one thing that I always do whenever I'm editing for a dark and moody vibe is to add a little bit of grain. I like the 35 millimeter grain. What it does here is it adds a little bit of that texture. So when you have something that feels darker and moodier, you're expecting a little bit of the grit. But there you go. There's a quick dark and moody edit, and I think that that just works really, really well with the Portra 160 Plus preset. Okay, so now we've gone through those two edits. We have our light and airy, we have our dark and moody. Let's bring it together and we'll have a more balanced and neutral look. And at the end of this, we can sort of talk about what look is best for what. Okay, back to square one. There we go. Gimmicks aside, let's get into the balanced and neutral edit and we can just work our way through it. So here for this image, the first thing that I'm noticing is that there's a lot of vignetting and some distortion. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to click that lens correction. You can see it is just evening out that exposure throughout the entire image. So we've applied lens correction here. And next I think I'm going to select, this was shot on a day that was a little overcast. So I'm going to use muted. And yeah, that looks nice. It adds a lot of punch. Ektar in general is a very punchy film. And so these two looks really work well for this balanced look. Now muted does a great job of harnessing Ektar, but dialing it back enough so that it doesn't feel overpowered. So I've applied the look. Next, I'm going to go to my exposure. And looking at this image, the exposure is actually really nice. I don't feel like it's too bright. I don't feel like it's too dark, but I do think that our temperature slider could be cooled off a little bit. If I'm looking at this shirt, I know that's, it's more of a neutral color and it's going a little green, maybe a little bit too warm. And my instinct is just to pull back on this just a hair. Not too much, just being very gentle, maybe push a little magenta in there. We were surrounded by a lot of green for this shot. And so I can see some of that coming through with his shirt. But that's looking pretty good. Just check, here's our before and after. Yeah, that's looking nice. I'm going to add, I don't want to add too much. One thing is it's good to be really gentle with your tin slider, especially. If you go too far, in fact, I'll go right here. I'm starting to see magenta just in this part of his hair, which I don't want. So that was too far. I'm going to dial this back. Yeah, right about there is good. One fun trick is if you are unsure about your white balance, you can go too far in one direction and then you just slowly kind of wiggle back and forth until you find a nice spot that looks natural and looks good to you. I think right about here looks right. I'm not sure where I started, but yeah, that looks pretty good. Now, one further tip, we've talked about our tone profiles, is we also have a tool called Strobe Soften. Now, I didn't use Strobe when I shot this photo. However, when I click Strobe Soften, what it does is it's going to soften a lot of the contrast while keeping the same color palette. And with a film like Ektar that has so much vibrancy and beautiful color to it, sometimes doing that can really go a long way. So here we're going to go back to 0, and you can just see how that softens, but those colors, the hues are staying the same. So really you're just softening that contrast overall versus the tone profiles, which are more directed towards the highlight shadow ends of your exposure. The last thing we could do if we want to is a spotlight tool. And the spotlight tool really just, well, it shines a light on your subject by bringing down the exposure of the background and bringing up and softening the contrast of your subject. So it's pretty subtle in this photo. I'll go ahead and I clicked our spotlight. I'll bring it back to 0 so you can see where it started. And as I continue to add it, you can see that the contrast with them is softening, but then the background is also coming down and it looks really nice. So yeah, right about there I think is good. And there is our neutral and balanced look. Each of these styles has its charm, has its abilities, has its way of conveying feeling and emotion through your editing. Experimenting with these different presets, experimenting with different looks and styles are going to help your creativity, are going to help you know what your clients are looking for and allow you to be able to achieve those looks. Practicing with these things in mind are going to free you up to be able to be a better photographer and a better editor. You've got this. Now, if you've enjoyed this little walkthrough and you want to see more like it, always, of course, be sure, subscribe, like, comment, let us know what kind of an editor you are. And you can always reach out to us at support@mastinlabs.com or directly at m.me/mastinlabs. So until next time, have a great day and happy editing.